Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Get 20 tips to avoid the latest fraud trends from 2023 in 2024. Discover the latest 6 fraud trends of last year and also how you can stay updated, avoid, and detect fraud in the vendor setup and maintenance process. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 276, 20 tips for avoiding 6 fraud trends from 2023 and 2024. Now, this is a webinar replay from December of 2023. I think it was from December 20th of 2023. And I have lots of good tips in there. It was sponsored by Vendor or Financial Operations Networks that has Vendor Info. And Vendor Info really is 2 different platforms or 2 different products. One is a vendor self-registration portal, which, by the way, gets all of that sensitive information out of email. And then the second tool that they have is a standalone tool that you, right, the team member, not the vendor, would use to do validation. So you would have one tool that will do all of your watch lists, IRS 10 match, US address, and even bank account ownership validation. So they sponsored this webinar again because that is a great way to avoid fraud, is using either one of those tools. So I do want to talk just a bit about the webinar, and then I'm going to go ahead and play the recording. But the description that I used was that fraud in the vendor process continues to evolve, and fraudsters are now blurring the line between consumer fraud and B2B fraud, because synthetic identity used to be just for consumers. And now it's starting to go over to vendors. So instead of having a vendor to call and say, hey, I didn't get my payment, when a fraudster, right, impersonated them and had them change either the remittance address for a check payment or the banking information for an ACH or a wire payment, they are just creating vendors. And so now they're creating IDs or vendors, and there's no vendor to even tell you that there was a fraud. So you need to make sure that you have processes in place so that you're not setting up these synthetic identities. And there are more. That's just one of the 6. So you do want to listen to this episode to discover what other fraud schemes trended in 2023. Including a surprising fraud trend that banks reported an 84% increase over 2022. So together again with Financial Operation Networks, Vendor Info, discover the risk of fraud in the vendor management process, which I'm probably preaching to the choir, but also what you can do to avoid payment fraud, and how a vendor self-registration portal can help. And then here's a breakdown of the 20 tips. So I have 4 tips to stay updated in the latest fraud trends, 5 tips to avoid fraud lurking in your email inbox, 4 tips to avoid fraud when receiving vendor information, 3 tips to avoid fraud when communicating with the vendor, and then lastly, 4 tips to detect fraud in your vendor process. Now, I am going to put a link in the show notes or the description if you are watching, accessing this on YouTube, but you can then click through to either watch the recording so you can see the presentation as as I discuss the 20 tips. Uh, and that will also allow you to download the handouts, which there's a PDF of the presentation, and then there is also a handout, a PDF handout from Financial Operations Networks on how to reduce the risk of payment fraud in 2023. So again, I will put a link to that in the show notes and the description, and please click through if you would be interested in downloading those handouts, or maybe just watching the video version of the webinar. Welcome to this month's 20 Tips in 20 Minutes webinar series, where the topic is avoiding the latest fraud, 2023 fraud trends as we go into 2024. This webinar is sponsored by Financial Operations Networks, and my name is Debra R. Richardson. The goal here is to give you some immediate takeaways so you can avoid fraud in your current manual process, but then give you some resources to automate your manual process, making vendor onboarding more efficient and really reducing the risk of or your fraud risk in your vendor process, because you're really getting that vendor documents out of email. But we'll talk more about that. So those, though, that are on during the Q&A at the end, since you are attending live, you will receive a free vendor banking form template via email after the webinar. I'll send those out by close of business today. But again, make sure that you are still on during the Q&A session. All right, so some housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded. You will receive a new link to the recording, and also where you can download handouts within 24 hours. When you receive it, we'd love it if you share it with other colleagues that you think might find this information valuable. Also, make sure you submit your questions anytime in the question/chat area. I think that's what it looks like for you. And then I will review those during the Q&A part or portion of the webinar. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts. There are 3. There is a PDF of this presentation. There's also a PDF from Financial Operations Networks on how to reduce risk of payment fraud through the automatic verification of bank account ownership. And then the last one is I have my 2024 vendor process training schedule for live training, where I go in depth on the tips that I really briefly walk through here, so you can plug up the gaps in your vendor process. Now, just a very quick bio on me. Again, I am Debra R. Richardson. I used to be an AP manager over global vendor setup and maintenance, where I had a team of 17, and we processed over 2,000 vendor requests per month and maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. And if you can imagine, right, that is a lot of potential for fraud. But now I work with vendor teams like yours to help them avoid fraud, fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So let's take a look at the agenda today. So first, first, we're going to look at the latest fraud trends in 2023. I've got 6. And then we will take a look at, very quickly, lightning speed, the 20 tips how to avoid the latest 2023 frauds in 2024. And then we'll have hopefully up to 5 minutes for Q&A. So again, when you think of questions, make sure you put them in the question section. But first, I'm going to go ahead and launch the only poll for this webinar. And if you could just answer very quickly, does your organization currently have a way to automatically validate bank account ownership? So go ahead and answer yes or no, but planning to deploy within 6 months. No, but planning to deploy within 6 to 18 months, or no, and no plans to deploy. So go ahead and answer that. I'll probably give about 20 seconds for that to be done. And then that way we can get started as soon as possible on the trends and then the 20 tips. So it looks like I have just over half that are voted. So if you haven't voted yet, go ahead and cast your vote. Try to get that to about 80% or so if we can't get everyone. So go ahead. Looks like we're at 68%. So just a few of you need to vote, and we can go ahead and take a look at the results. So it looks like I'm close to 80%. I've got 76 voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll, and then we will take a look at the results. And so it looks like the answer to the question of does your organization currently have a way to automatically verify bank account ownership? It looks like 42% of you said no, but planning to deploy within 6 to 18 months. And then 26% of you said no and no plans to deploy. And then 21% said no, but planning to deploy within 6 months. And then the lowest percentage, 11%, was yes. So that's great. So it looks like we have some that can do automatic bank account ownership validation, but we look like we also have a lot that are looking for solutions. And those that said no, maybe we can give you some ideas today. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And then let's go ahead and start with the latest fraud trends in 2023. And again, I have 6. So the first one is a hybrid of phishing and vishing. So the latest reports in 2023 show that the training that you're receiving for phishing scams actually is working. So how did the fraudsters then evolve because of that? Well, instead of having you click a link in a typical phishing email, they send an email, but they say that you've purchased something and then ask you to call a number if you have any questions. Well, when you call, or if you call, they will try to get that sensitive data via phone. And when they try to do phishing via phone, it is called vishing. So it's that hybrid phishing and then vishing, evolving scam that the fraudsters have turned to. The next one is check fraud, and check fraud has increased since the IRS, right back during the pandemic, since they put millions of stimulus checks in the mail during the pandemic. Criminals steal checks from mailboxes or ask you to change the remittance address for your check payment vendors. It's not just bank accounts anymore. And then when they get those checks, they will whitewash them and deposit them. Now, the next one is not a big surprise, the business email compromise, right? The vendor impersonation. So fraudsters that successfully phish or vish you or your vendors, or buy your vendors or your login credentials from the dark web from yet another breach. But because they have been very successful with getting the login credentials, they're in the actual emails and they send requests to change banking from an existing email string and make it seem more legitimate. So really quick, I have someone that says that they are not able to hear. If anyone else cannot hear, let me know. But according to my audio, it shows that it is working. So Tanya, you may just want to check your audio on your side. All right, so again, back to business email compromise, vendor impersonation. So the fraudsters are getting into your vendors, for example, email, sending a request to change banking from an existing email string that makes it seem more legitimate. Now, since I have started reporting new scam alerts, and I'll talk about that, there were 29 business email compromise victims that actually reported that they had a business email compromise. And that is the most since I have started. And I started back in 2019 of posting new scam alerts and victims of business email compromise. And so that has really grown. Now, one of the victims, by the way, this year was a school district in the South. And after that, that payment fraud via business email compromise, they actually switched to checks, which, based on the check fraud increase I just talked about, that switch probably did not solve their problem. The next one is B2B synthetic ID fraud. So fraudsters have expanded, creating fake identities from individuals now to businesses or your vendors. So they send requests to be set up in your vendor master file, and then they send fake invoices to be paid to those fraudulent accounts. The next one could guess, right? Generative AI in email, but also on websites and other assets. So fraudsters can use the dark web equivalent to ChatGPT called Worm GPT. That's just one. There's probably many more. And it's getting cheaper for fraudsters to get in business. And remember, it is a business for them, right, on their side too. It's just $75 a month for Worm GPT to start them on their criminal career. Other AI tools will let them create spoofed websites and other assets in days versus the weeks or maybe even months it used to take them, right, prior to AI to use in their fraudulent campaigns. Now, the last one is deepfake imposter scam. So back in 2020, there was a deepfake scam where a director's voice was cloned, and it was good enough to get the controller who knew the director and knew his voice, right, knew what his voice sounded like, to send a $35 million payment. Now in 2023, payments.com says that deepfake powered by AI is becoming a favorite tool for criminals. And it's very scary that they can use social media photos and AI to generate videos and voices that can be indistinguishable from the real ones. Now, all of these pain points can be resolved by using vendor info as either as a full-on vendor self-registration portal or as a standalone tool where you can get the onboarding process right out of email and perform all of your vendor validations in one place. More on that to come after the 20 tips. All right, so let's avoid those frauds I just talked about as we move into 2024 with these 20 tips. And so here we go.
So fraudsters are always evolving, and so it's critical that you stay up to date with the latest frauds and scams. So here are 4 places. The first one is the IRS tax scam alerts. They're e-news subscriptions. The IRS will email you right when they have tax scam alerts. Every year they have a dirty dozen list, but throughout the year they will email when they identify a new tax scam. Also, with that link, you can sign up for other types of alerts, and they just put a quick alert in there for the IRS e-filing tool. So make sure that you sign up for all applicable e-news subscriptions, including the tax scam alerts. The next one is the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. So I didn't even realize that there was a U.S. Postal Inspection Service until this year. But if you look at their homepage, the picture makes them look like SWAT. And their motto is security comes with the stamp. Who knew? But if you click on news when you get to their website, and by the way, all of these underlined links in the PDF are clickable. So if you click on the one for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, you get to their home page, click on news, and you can subscribe to receive alerts. Now, many of these alerts, especially in your area, are about thieves robbing the mail carriers for their blue box keys, right? That's how they're stealing checks from those blue boxes. They're robbing the mail carriers. So remember never to put your company checks in those blue boxes. That's probably 2 tips in 1 there. All right, so the next one is the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, or IC3. Now, they won't send you an email, but they do post both consumer and industry alerts. Back in the summer of 2022, they posted an industry alert for business identity compromise when talking about fraudsters using deep fake videos on video calls. Now, they did give a tip to make the see if it really is a deep fake, because at that point the technology wasn't where it probably is now. So this may or may not work. So they did give a tip to make them do a strange gesture, like put their hand up, turn their head, and cough. That might be the thing that could indicate for you whether you are on a video call with a deep fake fraudster for that video. So keep that in mind. And then the next one is the Vendor Process Training Center. Okay, this one's mine, but I do monitor all of these resources plus more. And I post alerts as they come, including all that I mentioned here from, again, these resources. And I have all of those 29 victims of business email compromise this year posted as well. So if you go to my website or go to this page and you sign up, every time I post, the next day you'll get a cumulative list of all the new scams and new frauds. All right, so the next one is avoid fraud in email. So did you know that your IT team's technology, firewalls, and other security protocols, they only block about 85% of all the fraudulent emails? Well, I guess that's a lot, but that still leaves you with 15% of fraudulent emails that you have to deal with. Per Microsoft themselves, if you have Microsoft Outlook, that figure is about 20% of those fraudulent emails are going to get through. So let's take a look at these 5 tips. So the first one is to use secure or encrypted email to collect sensitive data. So you can use regular data for instructions, responses to questions, but when it comes time to collecting that sensitive data on the W-9 or banking, let the vendor know that they will receive a request via secure email or encrypted email to submit that information. Now, one example for secure email is Mimecast. And you can even add fields within that email body to have the vendor input sensitive information. And then that way, maybe you can get rid of a form or you can use encrypted email. A solution that I recently used for one of my clients was Microsoft Purview. Didn't even know that existed, but it worked very well. The next one is authenticate the requester. If anybody's been around me and my content, you've probably definitely heard this before, but that means that before you accept the vendor supporting documentation via email, you verify who is submitting it by asking 2 to 3 identifying questions. The same way that your bank or actually any other place or organization where you may have an account, they'll make sure that they know that you are who you say they are before they start discussing the reason that you called. And so you need to do the same thing with your vendors, and you can do it via email or via phone. And if you click on the link in the PDF for this free training session, I do have a section of the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance workshop training course where the authentication portion of that workshop is free, and you even get a free download, the authentication reference template, so you can build it and then give it to all of your team members that handle inquiries from vendors and actually even from your internal employees if they contact you outside of work-related platforms. The next one is use a URL tool such as whois.com to check email address domains. So if there's something suspicious about that email, you might want to check that email domain, because many fraudsters will create spoofed domains just before they send out fraudulent emails, especially now that AI allows them to create websites and those assets much faster. So if you are suspicious about an email, you can copy and paste the domain and the email address into the whois.com/whois tool to check the registration date. Now, you will definitely not know when each of your vendors register their domain. That's not the point, but what it will show you, and it could be a red flag if the registration date is a few days or a few weeks old, because that could be an indication that the fraudster just created it for that specific campaign. The next one is to review email rules daily. So this tip actually came from the Secret Service. One of the problems I discussed is fraudsters in our actual emails because they have login credentials. And then once they get into your email or your vendor's email, they will hide the email that they sent requesting a change in banking, for example, by creating email rules to reroute or delete emails with the subject line that they are using. But if you check your email rules daily, you will find, then delete the rules, and then notify your IT team. And wouldn't it be great if your vendors did this too, so that you could be sure when you receive an email from them that it is really from them and not a fraudster. And then the last one is don't reply to those "are you there" or those 2-part emails. So fraudsters know that if they send an email and you respond and then they send a follow-up email, no matter whether it's suspicious or not, IT's fraud setting will probably let that second email go through. Why? Because they don't want to stop a transaction in play. So IT figures that they better let it go through, because if it's an email that's for a critical payment and it doesn't go through, then it's all their fault. But if they let it go through and it happens to result in a fraudulent payment, then it's all your fault. So fraudsters will ask if you're at your desk, those types of 2-part questions, right? And then send a change of banking or a malware attachment in that second email. So don't fall for that. All right, so let's take a look at collecting vendor information. So let's say you've gotten the vendor documentation from Risky Email to set up a vendor or change an existing vendor. there's some tips I definitely have on this one. So avoid internal team members collecting vendor info. So many of you might be gasping at this one because you may consider that the internal team member has a relationship with the vendor and will definitely know, right, that they're collecting the vendor supporting documentation from their actual vendor, but they can get social engineered too. And plus, this way you get to keep sensitive data from being unnecessarily exposed to them. The next one is to require authentication or authenticating data on the form. So do they want to change banking? Great, give us the existing banking. Do they want to change the remittance address for check payments where they want you to send the checks? Great, give us the existing remittance address. Also, make sure that you're collecting the internal team member that they have a relationship with, their contact information, in case there's any suspiciousness about the email. Now you got somebody to reach out to. Also, require your own company branded form. So one form I suggest you use, and many of you may already have it, is a vendor setup form. You can add fields. That's how you can add fields to collect the old and the new information for changes. For banking changes or collecting banking period, use the vendor banking form. And each of those forms, again, in addition to old and new data, other authenticating data, also ask for the internal employee, again, because if there is any suspicion around or red flags related to the forms of the email, you've got someone you can contact. And then the next one, make the banking on letterhead and voiding check or voided check submission like optional. And I know some of you are going, but hear me out. One, both of these forms can be forged, and two, who has really checks anymore? I know some of you have run into that already. So the only time I really do recommend the banking on letterhead is when there is a IBAN, because those can get long, and it's best to have something to compare it to because the vendors can fat finger it. Now, the good news with all of this is that when you start asking for more information on your own forms, you're not making it easy, you're making it harder for a fraudster to submit fraudulent banking on letterhead, for example, right? And so fraudsters would just go to the next potential victim that's not asking for all of this extra information and these extra documents. So communicating with the vendor, these tips. First one is to surround that confirmation call, right? Because last summer I had 2 clients that actually made the confirmation calls and still have fraudulent payments. So surround them with internal controls. The next one is when you do make that confirmation call, have a script for the team. One of the problems that I found is that they actually never really fully authenticated the actual banking because they just told or gave them all of the banking information. So have a confirmation call script, make sure you have authentication in it, and then document it because the vendors don't always pick up the first time, right? You may have to contact them again, and this way you have a record of what is still pending. The next one is if you use signature software, or you can use signature software, but just make sure you turn on authentication features. Signature software nowadays can have the vendors or their the points of contact you're dealing with submit government verification, take selfies. Maybe they don't want to do that for their employer, but you can give them a PIN number and then have them input that PIN number on when they sign the form or within that process, and that way you know it's your actual vendor. All right, so the last 4 we're going to go very quickly is detecting fraud. And so the first one is to validate bank account ownership. So validate that the vendor legal name matches the bank account holder name and that the tax ID that you have on file or that was submitted matches the tax ID used for the used to open up the bank account. The next one is to send After you make the bank change, right, send the vendor a notification to change. This way, if they did not request the change, they may be able to contact you before you pull that fraudulent banking into a pay file. Now, for example, when you do pull an ACH payments or the ACH payments into the pay file, if you have payments that are over a certain threshold that have had banking changes within 30, 60, 90 days, you can pull those before you send them to the bank, pull them, and have someone have just another set of eyes to make sure that the process was followed. And then lastly, if you do have once that pay file goes to the bank, if you have an unusually large payment, contact the vendor for ACH payments, for example, within 48 hours and just make sure they received it. If it's a wire, contact them the same day and make sure they received it. That way, if they didn't receive it, now you still have time to recover the funds, because you should be within your bank's window to request a recovery of those funds. So that was a lot. I've got 2 minutes left. We are going to definitely get to your questions. Hopefully you found at least one tip that you can use, but what about automating to get your vendor's sensitive data out of email, or automate all your validations with just one tool? So here are two options from vendor info. And so the first one is vendor onboarding. So you can digitize, streamline the collection and validation of vendor information during onboarding, really getting it out of risky email using their vendor self-registration portal. But there is also a standalone tool just for AP to perform multiple validations, including bank account ownership, IRS 10 match, watch list, and more. So you can click on these in the PDF, either one, to get more information, or you can contact Financial Operations Networks by email or phone that's listed here. And don't forget to download their handout, How to Reduce the Risk of Payment Fraud through the automatic verification of bank account ownership. Here's how to connect with me, but I do want to get straight to the question section. If you think of questions afterwards, you can always email info@debrarrichardson.com. And I will respond via email. Here's the two most frequently asked questions. Those that are still on now, look for that email with your vendor bank account or vendor banking form template. Now, I can stay on longer if anyone wants to continue asking questions. I'm going to check now to see if there are any questions out there. All right, so that is all that I see. Again, if you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to info@debrarrichardson.com. And if it's questions for vendor info, I will definitely get, or financial operations networks for their vendor info products, I'll definitely get that over to them to respond to. So we're a couple minutes over. I do thank everyone that joined today. And again, if you are on or were on at the time we started Q&A, look for that email later today with your vendor banking form template. So thanks everyone, and happy holidays. Bye guys.
All right, so I hope you got some good tips from that webinar. And if you are interested in downloading the handouts, then make sure that you click the link in the show notes and the description. And you will have to register for the webinar, but once you register, you'll see that you can download the handouts if you click the little paper icon on the left-hand side of the player. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 277th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.